situation in Sudan. I'd like to begin by thanking our speakers. For their time, and we're very much looking forward to hearing their interventions. My name is Ruba Al-Salibi, and I will be moderating the webinar today. A month ago, fighting broke out between the two biggest armed groups in Sudan, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The violence erupted after months of tension as the two rival groups wrangled for power. The fighting has deepened the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, where 1 in 3 people already relied on humanitarian assistance before the war. The current crisis also generated an unprecedented number of casualties, widespread human suffering, and devastation. The ongoing fighting affected every aspect of life in the country and led to a widespread evacuation of civilians and foreign diplomats. On May 12, the United Nations estimated that nearly 1 million people had fled Sudan, raising fears of the humanitarian crisis spiraling out of control. For civilians, the conflict has unleashed a nightmare of bombardment, random gunfire, home invasions, and looting, amid flickering electricity supply, shortages of water and food, and little chance of medical help with injuries. The power struggle between the SAF and the RSF had delayed the transition to the planned civilian government, which the Sudanese people have been aspiring to and fighting for. Our speakers will shed light on the current situation in Sudan and discuss means to put an end to this conflict and protect the Sudanese people. So given that we have many speakers today, we kindly ask each speaker to have 7 to 10 minutes for their interventions. And I would like to thank you again for your time and for being here with us today. So our first speaker will be Ernest Jan Hogendorn, who is a former senior advisor at the U.S. Department of State. Please, Mr. Ernest, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Just want to make sure, yep, my camera is on, and hopefully my speaker is as well. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to speak today about the situation in Sudan. Obviously, the crisis is extremely dire. Just to kind of situate it, Sudan is a country of 46 million people. Obviously, many of those people live in urban areas, and most, well, not most, but 7 to 10 million people are estimated to live in Khartoum itself, where the heaviest fighting is occurring. So we are facing a very, very dramatic humanitarian situation that is only going to escalate if the fighting continues, which I believe is unfortunately the likely scenario. What we have right now is we have an existential conflict between General Burhan and the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, and General Hemeti and his Rapid Support Forces. And frankly, I have not seen any kind of change in the balance of forces or the balance of fighting to suggest that either of them is going to back down in the near term. We also have another problem in that neither army is in a position to win this war anytime soon. So we are again looking at a grinding stalemate, which could be a huge problem. And last but not least, while people are kind of focusing on the fact that it is General Hemeti and General Burhan who are the leaders of these two armies, and I say so advisedly, all the indications we have is that command and control is starting to break down, and that we will likely see the fragmentation of these armed forces occurring over the interim, and that this is going to complicate any effort to try to achieve a peace in the future. Now, just to situate it for people, what I normally like to do is present 2 or 3 scenarios for the midterm for Sudan. The first, which is obviously the ideal, is that somehow international pressure is able to convince both General Burhan and Hemeti to return to the negotiating table, to negotiate a ceasefire that is sustained, and then are able and willing to agree to a transition to civilian transitional government that would then continue preparations for elections and hopefully a civilian and inclusive government after a vote. Unfortunately, given where we are now, I believe that that is probably the least likely scenario. I believe the two other scenarios I am going to describe are going to be much, much more likely. One of the scenarios I think is quite likely, and which is unfortunately the most problematic, is what I call the Lebanon scenario, which is where you have external actors supporting the different armed parties and essentially enabling both parties to continue to sustain pretty intensive conflict, not just in Khartoum, but in other parts of the country. If that's the case, that would probably make cities like Khartoum increasingly untenable for most people, and you would see massive refugee flows into the countryside and across the border into neighboring states, the Middle East, and probably also onto Europe. This would be an unmitigated humanitarian disaster that I think no one is prepared for, but that we should face starkly and should recognize is a real possibility. Another somewhat similar scenario, but just as concerning, would be that we do see the SAF ultimately prevailing because of its heavy weapons and light and air power, being able to expel the SRF from Khartoum, but not being defeated definitively, probably regrouping in Darfur, where most of its troops are from, and essentially creating a de facto autonomous Darfur state that would then create all the conditions we had seen previously in the 2000s during the first civil war in Darfur, and all the attendant local violence, atrocities, and unrest that troubled that part of Sudan 20 years ago. That, of course, would also be an unmitigated disaster, would also mean that the country is destabilized. And not just Sudan would be destabilized, but larger parts of the region, again, precipitating a major humanitarian crisis. Faced with these scenarios, I think we have to think very carefully about very difficult decisions that people may need to make when people will have to kind of balance the need to stop this fighting with a question of, whom or what should we do? Unfortunately, I think just putting pressure on both sides may not be enough to get the parties to negotiate in good faith, and that probably more will be necessary to force the different parties to recalibrate their calculations, either in Jeddah or some other negotiating position. And they will have to think very carefully about what is going to be required to change the balance of power, and then change the balance or the negotiating positions. I have argued in the past that the best way to do that is to try to get the main countries where General Burhan and General Hemeti hold their money, that is the Gulf states, to freeze bank accounts and to stop their activities in an effort to starve the ability of these people to continue to fight. And I believe that that is something that international partners should be trying to do. They should be trying to do that in coordination so that there is a united response. And hopefully that is something that countries will be working towards over the near term so that we can stop the fighting as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ernest, for your intervention and for the insights you've given us about the current situation in Sudan. We we'll now move to our second speaker, Annette Hoffman, who's a senior research fellow at the Conflict Research Unit of Klingenhandel. Please, Annette, please, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ruba, for the introduction, and thank you to the previous speaker. It's an honor to be on the panel, especially with people that I've read from and I'm learning from. So I feel honored to be part of the panel. Before I start, I would like to express my sympathies and condolences to the people of Sudan for all the suffering that you are going through, for all the fears and horrors that you are living on a daily basis. For this panel, I chose to shed light on the financial and business networks and the regional sponsors behind the war. So picking up actually on Mr. Hogendorn's last point, maybe. I won't go into the history, really. Of course, there is a whole history of Sudan's predatory production systems, which since long before independence have relied on the use and threat of violence, and which are one of the main drivers behind the ongoing militarization of the economy. But speaking more of the recent past, we see that in the last 2-3 decades, both armies, RSF and Sudanese armed forces, have amassed vast amounts of wealth, and that they control really sophisticated networks of companies that are estimated to make up 80% of economic activity in Sudan. On the one side, we have SAF that controls the economy in a much more institutionalized manner than the RSF. Most of it runs through its economic arm, the military-industrial complex, as well as other ostensibly charity organizations. These organizations and institutions are led by SAF leaders and their cronies, and they control companies, including seemingly private companies. The companies are not limited to the security or the defense sector, but straddle a whole range of sectors, such as agriculture, banking, mining, transport, construction, private security. And it's difficult to estimate the exact size, but estimates say that the military industrial complex alone controls over 200 companies with an annual revenue of $2 billion. It is estimated by the former transitional government of Dr. Hamdok that 80% of these companies are operating outside of any form of accountability, public accountability. And that was something the transitional government was pushing for. Now, on the other side, we have the RSF with its business networks that are more recently developed, but have come to compete with the businesses of the Sudanese armed forces. These businesses are really part of a family empire around a Dagalo family with Hamiti at the very center. They started off their business in Darfur as a militia, as you know, and gold played an important role. In 2017, they took over one of the key mines there, Jebel Amir, which is estimated to generate or to have generated around that time 54 million per year for the militia group that controlled it. The figures might have changed, but it's just to give an indication of the wealth. In Darfur, then the RSF controlled migration routes, different ones, and they made money by running these routes, but also by ostensibly curbing migration flows, including as part of European funded efforts. And then thirdly, their soldiers fought in, as did the soldiers of SAF, by the way, but they fought in Libya and Yemen and were rewarded for their efforts. And all this money was then reinvested into other sectors, more legit sectors, such as transport, construction, agriculture, livestock, very important, real estate, also banking. So we see the sectors overlap. They're enabling sectors for any business activity. ICT is a very important one for the RSF. Maybe just to give an indication, when Hamiti at one point in 2019 dared to display all his wealth, is when he deposited $1 million $1 billion into the central bank, which was paid for, or was meant to be paid for, to be paying for teachers and police. This money came from the rewards of his troops fighting in Yemen. Now, what is interesting about these networks is that they're extremely flexible and adaptive, which makes it difficult to target them. They are, as you know, maybe a good example is the publication we saw last summer by C4ADS, a nonprofit organization in the US that published in Arabic and English a sizable share of these businesses. And immediately after that publication, we saw a lot of new names of companies emerge, new front companies also appear, and different layers of intermediary businesses, in particular for those linked to the RSF. The second point I'd like to make is that there is a regional dimension to those networks, and both have very strong ties to regional sponsors. For SAF, this is mainly Egypt. SAF has, of course, strong ties with the Egyptian armed forces. And based on that military cooperation, there's also a strong cooperation at business level through individual businesses that have cooperation, but also more broadly through the military industrial complex. The cooperation on the economic side has a formal aspect and an informal aspect to it. So, for instance, there are several companies such as Multiple Directions, Green Zone, that have ties with the Egyptian intelligence or the military, which are not overt corporations, but they've been tracked down very clearly. On the other hand, from the RSF side, we see that the ties are strongest with the UAE. Some of their front companies belong to the RSF network. They're based in the UAE. And the RSF itself has a bank account in its own name at the First Abu Dhabi Bank. Most importantly for the UAE support is that the main destination for export, both legal and illegal, of Sudan's gold are the Emiratis, and a large part of that gold is owned by the Dagalo family. There is different businesses in gold that then have relations with, for instance, European companies, which I will come back to in a second. So with the war raging and a lot of infrastructure, factories and banks, not just being destroyed, but actually being targeted. We saw Omdurman Bank, which belongs to SAF, being looted last week. It's clear that domestic income streams will no longer provide resources to finance the war, or it will be increasingly difficult to mobilize these resources locally. So it is very likely that generals are going to rely increasingly on their regional sponsors. And that means mainly for South Egypt, and for the RSF, the Emiratis. So what can be done to prevent that from happening if, the urgent question here is how to stop that war and remain in scenario one as just outlined? There needs to be a stronger push for the application of targeted sanctions on business networks, and especially on their foreign branches that are more vulnerable to outside pressure. These sanctions should be targeted on companies that are benefiting mainly the generals and not the population. So I'm talking about the gold mining here, real estate, but also private security provisions. More caution obviously should be applied when dealing with companies active also in agriculture and banking, which are likely to impact the Sudanese population at large. The direct impact of the sanctions might be limited, but these measures will still create reputational damage for the networks and companies, and especially for their foreign business partners. Secondly, I think it's crucial to pressure Egypt and the UAE, at least from the Western side. I think the leverage of the West is fairly limited on the generals right now, but there is possibilities to pressure their sponsors, Egypt and UAE, to roll back their support to the generals. Not just the direct support, but also the enabling of the general businesses in their own countries. In the case of Egypt, the US obviously has significant leverage given the military aid given each year, but there is broader leverage, including the EU, with regard to institutions such as the IMF, with which the bankrupt Egyptian government is negotiating a new support package at the moment. On the other hand, in the UAE is very keen on being delisted from the Financial Action Task Force grey list. So public pressure campaigns shedding light on the UAE's role in the illicit trade in Sudanese gold may result in, private diplomatic efforts being more successful. Final point, this pressure would need to be coordinated. It's clear that no foreign actor will stop helping their Sudanese counterpart if the other side doesn't do the same. And Saudi Arabia can play an important role here to coordinate this effort and make sure that the pressure is put on both sides, Egypt and the UAE. These are pragmatic points, entry points to put pressure. I'm not saying that this is the only solution. I think the role of the civilians is key and should not be ignored, as it was largely during the political process that led us to this crisis. But so far, I think this is one entry point that hasn't been fully applied. And it is absolutely urgent that Sudan moves up on the priority list of many, if not most, Western countries. And the current events show that this lack of attention is a huge mistake. The lives of 46 million Sudanese are exposed to a brutal, senseless war. And so every effort is needed to stop that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anit, for your insightful analysis of the military-industrial complex in Sudan and how it's affecting the current political situation there. Just to note that we're going to be hearing our speakers, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions after. We will now move to our third speaker, Dr. Willow Burge, a senior lecturer in history in Newcastle University in the UK. Dr. Willow, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, again, I'd like to just express my condolences to everybody affected by the awful violence in Sudan. Particularly, I'd like to reinforce what Dr. Hoffman's just said. I think one of the things we see a lot in the media at the moment is questions are asked about the pressure that can be exercised on generals in Himeti, and there's a lot less attention on the enablers of Himeti and Burhan, many of whom have the Egyptians and Emiratis have considerable investments in Western countries that the Sudanese generals don't. So I think that's something I definitely want to reinforce that point. In terms of my talk, one of the things we were asked to talk about was the context of impunity and how impunity has enabled the abuses we're seeing in the current conflict. So I'm going to talk a bit about that now, both in terms of the current context of impunity and also the broader historic structural context of impunity for military actors in Sudan and how that shapes what we're seeing now. So obviously in terms of recent impunity, when Burhan and Himeti first emerged as the major players in the Transitional Military Council, as it first was in 2019, neither of two of them were named as people involved, wanted by the International Criminal Court for atrocities perpetrated in the Darfur conflict since 2003. But both of them were themselves deeply involved in that conflict. Himeti as a militia leader, a Janjaweed militia leader, and Burhan as one of the generals that armed that militia leader, armed those militias. Both of them as generals serving on the Transitional Military Council in 2019 were responsible for ordering the breakup of the famous civilian sit-in that had helped bring about the end of Bashir in April 2019, when Burhan and Himeti ordered the breakup of that civilian sit-in in June 2019. That led to a horrendous massacre of civilians, well over 100 civilians. Again, this was a massacre for which there's been no accountability, in part because Burhan and Himeti have gone on to continue to play such a role in the transitional government, leading up, of course, to the current conflict. Also, in terms of the impunity that has facilitated the current conflict, we can look at the institutions of the old regime, the National Congress Party era, the Umar al-Bashir era, that benefited from the impunity experienced by those who had been involved in the previous regime. The most serious trial we've seen has been for the leaders of the 1989 coup. But many of the old regime's institutions have not been dismantled, or those that were have been brought back in another form, like the public order police, or they've started to re-emerge de facto, like the National Congress Party itself was, in spite of being formally banned, practicing activity immediately before the outbreak of conflict. So soon after the original revolution in 2019, the transitional government established a committee known as Lajnat Izala and Tamkin, or the Empowerment Removal Committee, which sought to remove the process known as Tamkin, or empowerment, whereby the former regime embedded its partisans in every element of public life in Sudan. However, its work was effectively, the work of this committee, the Empowerment Removal Committee, was effectively brought to an end by Burhan's coup against the civilian component of his own transitional government in 2021. And if we look at institutions from the al-Bashir era that have been playing a role in stoking conflict, one of the most warmongering papers from the National Congress Party, the Al-Intibaha, which the Empowerment Removal Committee tried to deal with, this famously militaristic paper, Al-Intibaha, remained influential, was involved in stirring up unrest in eastern Sudan before Burhan's coup in October 2021, and since the conflict broke out, has been one of the most warmongering voices on the side of the army. At the same time, it's important not just to see the crisis today as the product of an avoidable failure to try particular individuals and institutions. We need to look at a much more long-term structural impunity, which has defined all of Sudan's post-uprising transitions, whether the 1964 to 1965 transition, after the first uprising, the 1985 to 1986 transition after the second uprising, or today's transition. 1964, the first radical transitional government had aspirations to try the military leadership for war crimes perpetrated in what is now the independent nation of South Sudan. That didn't happen because more conservative parties pushed aside the first transitional government, promised the soldiers they wouldn't be tried if they allowed a transition to parliamentary democracy, and you had a transition to an Umar Party and National Unionist Party-led government that continued the war in the regions. 1985, the situation was slightly different in that the leaders of the former regime, or some of them that were in the country, were put on trial to answer for their coup in 1969. So leaders of the 1969 coup were put on trial, but some of them were tried for corrupt accumulation of wealth, but they were never tried for responsibility for the war in the regions, in spite of the fact that war had broken out again in Sudan 2 years earlier. Again, today, you saw the same pattern. People were put on trial for the 1989 coup that brought Omar al-Bashir to power, but there was much more dissimulation about the possibility of putting people on trial for war crimes in Darfur and elsewhere, whether that was through an international criminal court process or through a national process. And the reason for this is that throughout Sudan's 20th and 21st century, wars, throughout the transitions, throughout the coups, the whole security infrastructure, whether that's the intelligence services, the police, and most importantly, the army, has remained dominated at its uppermost echelons by a small cadre of officers with social roots in the northern riverine, in the riverine area to the north of Khartoum, the region that's benefited most from the historic exploitation of the marginalized regions of Sudan, whether that was through the 19th century slave trade, the uneven development of the colonial era, or the post-independence wars in, first of all, the south, then the east, the Nuba Mountains, and Darfur. The civilian leadership of the various historic parties, some of whom are now major players in FFC Central Council or Democratic Bloc. The Ummah, the various unionist parties, the Islamists, the Baathists, even to some extent the communists, have been dominated by that same social class, and the bargains that it's historically struck with the military have defined what the Sudanese nation itself is seen to represent. The Ummah party is a slightly different element in this dynamic in that it does have some historic ties to militias in Western Sudan, which again maybe explains some of its relationship with Hemeti in the current dynamic. But anyway, the point I want to make here is that, again, I think there's been a lot of hope today about this principle of returning to the idea of the Sudan Armed Forces as an independent, professional, apolitical institution. But the Sudanese army has never been that, even before the Islamists in 1989, even before the current tussle between Hemeti, the Rapid Support Forces, and the Islamists over the future of the Sudanese army. It's always been political, both in terms of who its officer class represents, its role in the wars, and its role in shaping the Sudanese nation itself. And this is a major factor in why war crimes perpetrated in the marginalized regions of Sudan, whether southern Sudan historically or today Darfur, haven't been prosecuted. Today, the transitional military did not stop two of the indictees of the International Criminal Court, Umar al-Bashir and Abdul Rahim Mohammed Hussein, being put on trial for overthrowing democracy. Of course, it hasn't reached a conclusion yet, and it's unlikely to in the immediate future. But they would never sanction the possibility, really, of them being put on trial, either internationally or nationally, for war crimes in the regions. The one person who has been put on trial by the International Criminal Court is Ali Kushaib, a local militia leader in Darfur, seen by the security establishment as more expendable than people like Umar al-Bashir himself and Abdul Rahim Mohammed Hussein, who are part of that core Northern Riverine officer class. Of course, we have seen a major change. So that explains most of the historic pattern of impunity in Sudan. But of course, one thing we do have to say is there's been something of a shift in this pattern of impunity also today with the rise of Hemeti as a Darfuri militia leader who is trying to effectively reverse this whole security logic in Sudan by seizing power in Khartoum, when historically the role of militia leaders like Hemeti had been to act as Khartoum's instrument in the regions. His own impunity, of course, comes from the considerable wealth and resources he's amassed, all the companies he runs, which we saw discussed in the last talk, his prominent international backers. So Hemeti's abuses and the abuses that are being perpetrated by the Rapid Support Forces in Khartoum right now represent something of a shift in terms of historic patterns of impunity in Sudan that began with the massacre of civilians in Khartoum at the sit-in site in 2019, and of course is continuing right now during the current conflict. At the same time, obviously, the Sudan Armed Forces itself, bombing in Khartoum, bombing heavily populated areas in Khartoum, is often also a shift in the patterns of impunity, because historically the Sudanese Air Force bombed areas in the marginalized peripheries of the country that the Sudanese officer class saw as on the peripheries of what they understood to be on the Sudanese nation. Historically, part of the reason that transitions in 64 and 85 happened so relatively peacefully because the protest happened in Khartoum, and the military class was much more nervous to attack civilians in Khartoum. Obviously, this dynamic now seems to be changing. So I guess my overall point is that today's impunity has deep historic roots. We're also seeing a shift in that pattern of impunity as well. Okay, thank you. That's me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Willow, on your analysis of the historical roots of impunity in the context of Sudan. That was really insightful, and we will have time, hopefully, to discuss this after we hear the rest of our speakers. We will now move to our fourth speaker, Hiba Morgan, Al Jazeera English correspondent. Hiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wanted to start talking about the sanctions, but we've heard about that from Dr. Enes Kaufman, and about the impact of impunity or lack of, or justice and accountability, or lack of justice and accountability. We've heard that from Riddle. I think one thing we have to look at in this conflict is how the regional and international countries interact with Dr. Enes, you can hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. All right. I thought I could not hear me. Right. So I think we should look at the engagements of regional and international countries or Western countries with both sides, the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Army. Now, we're seeing the talks in Jeddah that is being mediated by both Saudi Arabia and the United States. These are two parties or two countries that are familiar with Sudan.
I'm so sorry, Hiba, to interrupt you, but it seems that the voice is not very clear. Actually, you can't hear you properly. The voice is not very clear. Actually, broken up.
Yeah, I'm in Khartoum and there are network issues. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, but it's just not very clear.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
It's just not very clear.
Yeah, the network in Khartoum is not very stable. So I'll try to speak a bit slow so that what I say doesn't get lost with the audio. Is it still bad?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's it's just maybe if you can try just audio without having your video on, might make it better. Hiba, are you still with us? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, we're really sorry, Hiba. It doesn't seem like we can hear you. Seems like there's an issue with maybe the connection there. Hiba, you're still with us? Maybe we can move to our next speaker and then come back to you, Hiba, to see if the connection is better.
Yeah, it will be fine.
Okay, so maybe we'll go to our next speaker and then come back to you, Hiba, and hopefully, the connection would be better and we would hear you more clearly, if you don't mind. Okay, maybe let us move to Justin and then come back to Hiba. I know the internet connection in Sudan is now weak. So okay, maybe let's move to Justin then, and then we'll come back to you, Hiba, and hopefully would hear you better.
Okay, should I begin?
Yes, so let me just introduce you very quickly. So yeah, now we will be hearing our fifth speaker, Justin Lynch, who's a researcher and co-author of the book, Sudan's Unfinished Democracy. Thank you so much, Justin, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and for the introduction. And it's really an honor to be on this panel as well. I wanted to talk about the protest movement in Sudan, where it started, which I think informs where we could go. There have been a lot of critiques about the current mediation process, that it is not centered on civilians. And so I think that I wanted to speak about where the protest movement went in 2019 and the current state of the resistance committees. And if there's one point that I would like to make, and that I'll keep coming back to, it's that grassroots organizations like the Sudan Professionals Association that really led the protests, and the resistance committees, when they're tasked with political bargaining, it really changes the structure of them, and it presents new challenges for these organizations. And I think that we need to recognize what those challenges will be and what the effects of this political bargaining process will be on these organizations. So to start, I wanted to talk about the Sudan Professionals Association, which was really one of the groups that was, had the one of the most leadership during the protests in 2019. And so, I think interestingly, it started off as a movement very specific and very targeted, that was really to raise the minimum wage in Khartoum, right? So it was a very urban organization at first, and it was an organization that had a focus on really the upper middle class of the Khartoum neighborhoods. And I think that this really specific objective gave its members a very clear vision of how to organize themselves. And the members were very motivated to be part of this organization, right? This kind of wasn't a fluid membership. This was a very motivated group that was part of the SPA. And so, what happened in December 2018 was spontaneous protests that took place, and the organization really had a decision to make. And they changed their goals from one that was focused on minimum wage to one that would take down the Omar al-Bashir regime. And so I think that when the SBA was first created, and the kind of broad protest movement was created, it was an incredibly flat structure in terms of organizational hierarchy. And it gave the organization a big advantage when it came to trying to, topple a dictator, because, a dictator's tactic when it comes to preventing a protest movement against them is really to kind of pay off the leaders, to buy off the leaders, to make political bargaining with the leaders, or to try and eliminate the leaders through either repression or through other means. And the fact that, that the SPA, like so many other protest movements throughout history, have a grassroots structure, is because it means that it is nearly impossible to stop the leadership, right? Because the leadership is very weak, right? So what that means is that there is a broad support, and it's very spontaneous. Of course, this is very difficult to build up, and this process, was, we have to be honest in that it was supported by years and years of trial and error that started in 2012, if you kind of look back at the kind of movement for how the SBA began. And so, the kind of key success for the SBA was the April 5th call in 2019 to call on soldiers to remove al-Bashir, right? So it took al-Bashir's key pillar of power, which was his military, and it turned that against him, right? This is what Gene Sharp would call political jujitsu, right? Where you use a regime's biggest tools and you strip it from them, right? You strip their biggest pillar of power. And so I think that, once the SBA and the Sudan protest movement their goal was never just to remove Bashir. Their goal was to remove the entire system, right? And they made a critical decision at that point to negotiate with the military and to enter into negotiations. And so the SBA decided that the Forces of Freedom and Change would kind of take on that negotiation and that leadership role. And so broadly, what you saw was a movement that was very grassroots led, starting to take on a leadership structure, right? The kind of scaffolding of leadership that is, that is necessary for political bargaining, right? And what you saw was an SBA and a broader protest movement that really struggled with that shift from being a grassroots movement to one that had a political leadership, right? I remember speaking with so many members of the SBA during this transitional period, and they disagreed with what their own leaders in the SBA and in the FFC were doing, because they felt like they were selling out the revolution, right? Or the leaders of these two movements felt like, look, this is the best offer that we can get, right? And so you could start to see the divisions within the SBA and within the protest movement at that point, between the leaders who were tasked with bargaining and the protesters who were very idealistic, and who wanted to continue to take on the broader regime that Omar al-Bashir had created. And I think this tension, right, this shift and this challenge that Sudan's protest movement had, turning from a grassroots organization to one that had to do political bargaining, is one that you see, it's not unique to Sudan. This is, a case of, political science. You saw it in Egypt during 2011, where, protesters from this very flat structure struggled to build more of a leadership structure. You saw this in Otpor in Serbia in the 2000s, where, this student movement had toppled Milosevic, but then struggled to, I don't think they even were, they didn't get past the electoral barrier during the first parliamentary elections that took place a year later. And so, throughout history, you can see how these organizations struggle to build the political leadership necessary. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the rise of the resistance committees. And I think that, the kind of, as the SBA started to have this infighting, the resistance committees became more prominent. And they are, loosely affiliated, neighborhood groups that provide essential services really on the local level and really on the ground. And so, they are even much more grassroots than the SBA was. And, a main feature of the resistance committees has been opposition to the continued role of the military in politics, and of the political status quo in general in Khartoum, right? But I think that it's important, to note as well that the resistance committees take on a different dimension outside of Khartoum, right? I remember meeting a lot of the resistance committee members in El Janina in West Darfur, and they were really, youth groups who had, who were affiliated based on their tribal identity. And there were, different resistance committees for the different tribal groups in every city, right? And so it wasn't based on kind of the shared principles that we associate with the resistance committees in Khartoum, but they were more closely, they could more accurately be defined really as kind of youth groups. And so I think that one of the things that, I think as researchers and as, practitioners and as journalists, we need to do is do a better job of really understanding the resistance committees and taking them at face value, and really studying them in a way that is much more in depth than I think some of the superficial work. And I think that, there are so many great Sudanese writers, Muzan Al-Nil had a great piece the other day. And I think we need more of this type of research to really get to the grassroots. And I shouldn't say grassroots, the real understanding of the resistance committee members, because there were so many contradictions and interesting facets that we have not yet really grappled with publicly about the resistance committees. I think that, when I speak and, with so many resistance committee members today, and in the past, they were very clear that they do not want to get involved in politics. And I think this is a really important question. And what I mean by that is that, they do not want to become politicians themselves, right? The resistance committees, in many ways, want to hold politicians to account, and they see themselves as kind of above politics. And I think it's a really interesting viewpoint that we need to understand more. And I kind of explain it as a lot of the resistance committee members have seen opposition politicians, really sell themselves and negotiate compromise with the Sudanese regime throughout their whole lifetime. And so they also have seen that being in politics is really dangerous, right? Both kind of personally, professionally, it gets them in trouble. And so I think that kind of resistance to get involved in, capital P politics is one that we need to kind of study more. But of course, the resistance committees at a grassroots level are extremely powerful in politics as it relates to grassroots activity, right? In terms of service delivery and a lot of the things that I think that, political parties would, really, kind of do, right? This kind of local service delivery. And so I think that is an issue that we need to study more. And I think one of the last points I want to make about the resistance committees is why in 2011, after the coup against Abdullah Hamdok and the civilian part of the transitional government, why protesters were unable to, prevent, why they were unable to return to a path of a true transition. And I think the difference, one of the key differences is that the resistance committees in 2021, they did not want to negotiate and compromise with the military, right? They believed that the military should abandon politics altogether. And this is a key distinction from the SBA in 2019, when they called on the military to perform a coup against Omar al-Bashir, right? Using the military's own power, which is the mid-level soldiers, the low-level soldiers against it. And there was a key difference in those tactics there. And so, I think that is an important distinction for why the resistance committees might not have been successful in 2021, because we saw, huge protests after Hamdok was removed from office. And so, I think that as we, there are discussions about a peace, peace negotiation, mediation, and there have been discussions about the role of resistance committees and civil society in Sudan. We need to be honest, and we need to be, we need to understand that putting a political, that charging these groups with political bargaining will change them, and we need to anticipate that and also give them the support and time that they need to ensure that that it is successful if and when that happens. And so I think that what to do next. I think that the reality is that the international community, I think especially the West, has a limited ability to really stop the war in Sudan, I think, as the other panelists have said. But I think that, what it can try and prevent is its intensity and its spread to other countries. And I think key here is making sure that the war, stays in Sudan and it doesn't become a proxy conflict between Egypt and the UAE, which I think other panelists have spoke about as well. I think the two final points. One is that, in Washington, D.C. and in capitals in the West, the debate becomes about, sanctions or no sanctions. And I think, we need to make sure that our policy isn't characterized by just that question, right? We need to have a broader strategy beyond sanction or no sanctions, right? We have to be honest with the fact that, financial sanctions will be limited in their effectiveness, right? There have been sanctions on Sudan for 30 years. Many of these military companies, some of them face sanctions already. And so how effective will they be in actually stopping the war? I think that, will they have an impact? Maybe, right? We need to be honest about that. We don't have a certainty for how effective they will be, but we need to have a strategy beyond sanctions or no sanctions that we often see in the Sudans, right? And the last thing that I think we need to be realistic about as the war continues is the role of humanitarian aid and how it's going to affect the conflict. When I worked for the UN and for NGOs in Sudan, our community, we were really awful at stopping the politicization of aid by armed groups. And I think that the struggle, we really haven't seen the leadership from the humanitarian community, from the UN, and from OCHA on this issue and taking it seriously, right? There's a history of pledging to have a principled response to humanitarian aid and donors not following through on that. And I think this is, a very political issue, although it is, one that is humanitarian. This is one that affects politics on the ground, because if you are in a conflict area, humanitarian aid really is a lot of your livelihood. And so I think that politicians need to be taking this seriously and make sure that it is not used for, to further entrench the political actors on the ground and the warring parties on the ground. And so I think with that, I will hand it over. And again, thank you for having me. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin, for the many important points you raised, especially about the Sudanese protest movement and the resistance committees, as well as on the politics of humanitarian aid. That was very insightful. We will now be moving to our next speaker, Professor Alex Diwal, who's an executive director of the World Peace Foundation. Unfortunately, Professor Alex is not here with us today, but he sent us a video of his comment on the current situation in Sudan, and we will be showing this video now.
Thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation, and my apologies that I'm not able to join you in person live. Let me start off by giving my condolences and commiserations to all of you who are Sudanese or have friends and relatives in Sudan who are caught up in this totally needless, horrific, horrendous conflict. Sudan deserves much, much better. The beautiful, non-violent revolution that we saw unfold in Sudan, led by ordinary, unarmed civilians, many of them women, just 4 years ago, shows the type of country that Sudanese are capable of building, in total contrast to the horror that is being inflicted on that wonderful country by these two, let me call them warlords or gangsters. So the current state of affairs, as I'm sure you are all familiar, is egregious violations of international humanitarian law. Most visibly, most horribly in Khartoum, in the three towns, but also in many, many other parts of the country as well. There are attacks on civilians and on civilian infrastructure. The forces of one side or the other are occupying and looting private residences, terrorizing civilians, occupying hospitals, preventing medical staff from doing their essential duties. There are also bombardments, including aerial bombardments of civilian targets. Schools have been attacked and obviously are not functioning. Markets are not functioning. And starvation crimes are being perpetrated at scale. Now, the definition of the war crime of starvation is depriving, destroying, or rendering useless objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. So that includes not just food and foodstuffs, but also water and shelter, maternal care for children. And in an urban setting such as Khartoum, objects indispensable for survival also include electricity, telecommunications, and basic infrastructure for the conduct of everyday life. All these are being destroyed, disrupted, and these are crimes for which military commanders and military leaders should be called out and should in due course be held accountable. Let me say a few remarks on the status of the belligerents. They are two non-state belligerents. Neither of them can be said to represent the Sudanese state. There was a coup d'etat overthrowing a constitutional process, a constitutionally recognized government in October of 2021. And quite correctly, the African Union Peace and Security Council invoked the relevant article of its constitutive act and suspended Sudan until such time as constitutional order were restored in the form of a civilian government. And when the two sides signed their declaration of commitment to protect civilians in Jeddah last Thursday, one signed as the Rapid Support Forces, clearly a non-state actor. The other signed as the Sudan Armed Forces and not as the government of Sudan. And that is quite correct. It is not the government of Sudan. It is also a force that aspires to be the government of Sudan, but is not the recognized government. It is merely the Sudan Armed Forces. Now, this is significant, I think, because as the case of Sudan comes to the League of Arab States, to the African Union, and to the UN Security Council, the Sudan Armed Forces will try and clothe itself as the legitimate government trying to suppress a rebellion. And I think we should be absolutely clear that it is not that. And neither, of course, is the Rapid Support Forces. They are both non-state armed actors. And moreover, they have a practical and actual material character that should prohibit them from being recognized as such. They are both forces that have been engaged over the years in deeply corrupt and anti-democratic practices, racketeering, profiteering, kleptocracy. What we are seeing in Khartoum today, it resembles a civil war, but I think it could more accurately be called a mobster shootout. What we have is two kleptocratic systems fighting it out for control of ill-gotten gains. Now, I said I made mention of the Jeddah Declaration of Commitment for the Protection of Civilians, which was signed last week. Was this a step forward or not? Now, in it, all the two parties do is they recognize commitments under international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, that they ought to be respecting in any case. It is merely an affirmation of their existing obligations as belligerents. But there's one thing that I was disturbed to see was not present in this Jeddah protocol. And that was there was no recognition that local civilian humanitarian actors, local Sudanese resistance committees, doctors, local residents actually are the people who are doing the lion's share of the essential humanitarian work. Under normal circumstances, the great majority of humanitarian work in Sudan is done by Sudanese. And under current circumstances, that is especially the case because the United Nations and international humanitarian organizations are thin on the ground. Many of them have evacuated their international personnel. And I think it's very important as a matter of material fact, and because of the ethical and legal obligations on the belligerents, but also as a political affirmation of the role of civilians in Sudan, that the principal preeminent role of ordinary civilians in essential humanitarian action should be recognized and protected. Now, what we've seen in the 5 or 6 days since that protocol was signed in Jeddah is actually, it is not being recognized. There is nothing resembling a humanitarian truce, or even in a limited attempt to permit or to facilitate or enable humanitarian relief to assist those in need. It is, to all intents and purposes, a dead letter. It has been a test of the commitment of those two parties to basic humanitarian principles, and they have failed at that test. Let me make another remark about something else that I'm sure you will be discussing that happened last Thursday, which was the UN Human Rights Council met in a special session to award the Human Rights Rapporteur additional powers to monitor and report on what is going on in Sudan. This might seem to be an unexceptional, routine, quite appropriate step that ought to be welcomed by everybody. Sadly, this wasn't the case. The representative of the Sudan Armed Forces, who was allowed, and I would object to this, he was permitted to address the meeting as a representative of the government of Sudan, objected to this, saying it was a matter of internal affairs only within Sudan, and that Sudan sought an African solution to this problem. And that was an alarming misuse of that phrase. What we saw as well was the Saudi Arabian delegate campaigning, lobbying for the resolution not to be accepted on the grounds that this might impede, might get in the way of the negotiations ongoing in Jeddah. Now, why should basic humanitarian and human rights obligations get in the way of negotiations towards a ceasefire? The idea that it might do so is, I think, reprehensible and indicates that the Saudi delegation was perhaps not acting in good faith when it convened the parties. Perhaps it was not intending to see an outcome that respected the rights of the Sudanese people. Maybe it more respected the privileges of those military leaders who are represented in the talks. But more alarming was the fact that not only the delegate of the Sudan Armed Forces misrepresenting himself as the government of Sudan, but a number of other African delegations also said the same thing. African solutions to African problems meant rejecting the role of the United Nations. And all of the African members of the Council either abstained or voted against. Now, it seems to me this is absurd. The idea of African solutions should not be a pretext for ignoring or downgrading the obligations of African states under the UN Charter, under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and indeed the obligations under the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself. Those same African states have willingly signed on to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Declaration on Democracy, Governance and Elections, and the Constitutive Act of the African Union itself, which has at its center the norm, the principle of non-indifference. This was adopted after the genocide in Rwanda and the failure of the international community, including the African community, to act to prevent or to stop that genocide. The norm of non-indifference obliges African states to act when there are egregious abuses of human rights, crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. And these are things that we are seeing in Sudan, perhaps not genocide, but certainly war crimes being perpetrated. And the idea that African states could fail to act because these are universal norms is absolutely unacceptable. African solutions does not mean the rule of the gun. African solutions means that African states are held accountable to the standards, the principles that they themselves have adopted at the African Union and at the United Nations. So let me conclude by reiterating my condolences for all of the Sudanese who have lost friends, family members in this needless, atrocious conflict, and my sympathies to all Sudanese caught up in this war that they did not want, that they did not instigate. This war must stop, and this war will be stopped in a sustainable way when universal principles of human rights are upheld by the Sudanese in Sudan. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alex. For the sake of time, we'll move to our next speaker, Khulud Khair, founding director of Confluence Advisory. Khulud, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruba. I'd like to start by saying something which is obviously glaringly obvious to all of us now, which is that the resistance committees were right when they refused to speak to the generals, when they refused to give them a platform, when they refused to side by elites who signed a very unworkable framework agreement. They were right. They were right precisely because they knew that the generals being in a position to wage this war with full impunity, as the agreement implied, meant that this would hasten a civil war scenario, or at least a conflict scenario, which is what we have now. The resistance committees also know, to a great extent, that they are alone. They cannot rely on the Human Rights Council in Geneva, as Alex just said. They cannot rely on the region. We know that the Arab states, who have a lot of political and financial investments in Sudan, do not want democracy. They cannot even rely on the international actors who ostensibly do want democracy, and for whom it is most egregious that they have been ignored by. And so, where does that leave them? It leaves them as, the most important political engine in Sudan, previously for political reasons and now for humanitarian reasons. And they still do not have the requisite, they haven't earned the international support that would allow them, for example, to be engaged in some way or another in formal mediations. We have seen them come at a distant last when discussions around including civilians have taken place. The Jeddah talks, which to me are nothing to write home about, have more than anything entrenched the view that the generals could be legitimate actors. And as Alex said, they are officially, or they have become in many ways so illegitimate as to be seen as non-state actors. And yet we're still seeing that the international community is preferring to speak to them, is preferring to legitimize their positions, much as it did during the coup, much as it did afterwards, much as it did through various atrocities, and Willow has charted for us very well that history of impunity domestically, but of course that is very much fitting into an international framework of impunity. And as Aneta, highlighted, there are also various ways in which the international community's financial transactions with the generals and with the military project in general in Sudan have been allowed to continue. And all of these different sort of aspects of engagements in Sudan completely miss where the real politics in Sudan is happening. And this is small P politics of organizing and giving community support, not just in wartime, but also before. But it also misses the extent to which resistance committees can play a part in big P politics. It's not that resistance committees are not, just not understood by the international community, is that there has been a willful ignorance around the resistance committees and trying to understand not just how they work, but to work with them on their terms. That has always been a central challenge in the engagement with these resistance committees, but they have persevered regardless. So what do I mean by that? On the political front, the head of the UN mission in Sudan had been tasked with engaging with the resistance committees as a political bloc, or at least as a political constituency. They had agreed and said that because of the way we work, we have maximum transparency where we can, and we would like to have these meetings out in the open where our members can also join in, or at least listen in on what is being said. The UN abjectly refused and didn't really bother to engage with the resistance committees very meaningfully after that. Now that we're talking about humanitarian response, and I've been in several meetings just this week around the humanitarian response and what is required, there is this push to have the resistance committees effectively become implementing partners for INGOs and the UN while they try and figure out how to engage in Sudan, rather than seeing that the work is already being done and falling in lockstep behind the resistance committees. So, at every turn, whether on the diplomatic political front or on the humanitarian front, we're seeing resistance committees effectively being sidelined because they won't fit a mold, rather than looking at Sudan as an opportunity to engage with a robust, independent, engine that has outlasted, frankly, not just the regime's repression and division tactics, but also the international community's shunning, if you will. And I think, going back to what Justin was saying, that the resistance committees need to be studied, they absolutely do, but they need to be engaged more than anything. They need to be studied for the sake of being engaged, and politically so, not just for the sake of saying that we kind of now understand these bodies. What is the point of understanding them if they are not engaged on their terms? Unfortunately, what we're seeing from the various mediation platforms, Jeddah for now, but also the upcoming mediation platform, IGAD, etc., there's not as much of a emphasis or a focus on engaging not just resistance committees, but youth groups, civil society groups, unions, etc., some of whom are elected bodies, and so absolutely deserve a seat at the table based on international rubrics of representation, etc. And we're not seeing any of that. Alex mentioned last week's Human Rights Council vote that took place on the same day as the Juba mediation agreement on humanitarian corridors. I would say that's a dark day for international engagement. We saw failures on both those fronts. Yes, the Human Rights Council document, or the vote, passed, but it was a very weak document. There weren't really the monitoring mechanisms that we needed to see. As Alex said, the Sudan Armed Forces representative was allowed to represent the government of Sudan, even though the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces have effectively made themselves completely illegitimate as political actors. And at the same time in Jeddah, we saw them effectively being rubber stamped as official and, more importantly, legitimate combatants in this war. I don't know if anyone's been following what's been happening today, or in the past week, but we have seen successive rounds of fighting in not just densely populated areas, but also in institutes of knowledge, hospitals, parts of the city that hold either knowledge or services or are key to the communities in which they're in. It's quite clear that while the generals are fighting each other, they're also fighting the people of Sudan. And on that front, they are very much united. We're seeing this iconoclastic drive by the generals to completely sort of eradicate any trace of civilian life that could be used to relaunch civic politics, either during or after some kind of ceasefire is negotiated, and that's by no means soon. EJ earlier mentioned that this doesn't look like it's anything going to end anytime soon, and I would agree with that, because neither side, and there are I'm just saying, there are two broad sides, but within them, of course, there are factions. But broadly, neither the Sudan Armed Forces nor the Rapid Support Forces have any interest right now in a ceasefire. So we're not going to see that anytime soon. It therefore behooves the international mediation platforms, whether it's in Jeddah, although I don't pay much attention to Jeddah anymore because I don't think that's a very useful platform, or elsewhere, IGAD, etc., without the engagement of this, not just one or two representatives from the civilians, but several representatives from the civilian bloc, these talks will amount to nothing. What's interesting is that the UN, which obviously has a lot of deserved criticism, has done this differently in Libya. In Libya, the civilians were the core of the mediation, and the generals were sort of invited to join that mediation. And some, like Haftar, for example, was at some point not engaged, at other points engaged. So the central part, the central focus of the mediation was the civilians. We're seeing that the complete opposite of that in Khartoum, which is quite egregious because Sudan has such a well-developed civil society space. So, the question is not just how do we engage the civilians, how do we get away from the political decisions that keep them at bay? Because at this point, it's no longer accidental. At this point, choices are being made about who to include and who to exclude, both by the international community and by the elites in Khartoum. And frankly, because as I said earlier, the resistance committees were right all along, it's criminal that they are not engaged. It's criminal that what they foresaw has not earned them a seat at the table. Now, what does that look like? The answer is they need to decide. Do they want to engage with these platforms? And if so, how? That is the starting point of engaging the civilians. It is not, speaking to the generals, then handpicking civilians from the Sudanese political elite and just tacking them onto whatever's been agreed. We saw that with the framework agreement. That framework agreement in many ways led us to where we are in the way that we are, in the way that the sort of the conflict broke out. I reject the kind of analysis that says, the generals have always had these disagreements between them, and so this fight was inevitable at the end. Yes, this fight was in many ways inevitable. Yes, the generals have always had these problems between them. Why did the conflict start when it started in the way that it started, if not for the framework agreement? And yet what we're seeing now is efforts, the beginnings of efforts to revive that framework agreement, which not only are frankly unworkable, and the proof is in the pudding, but very much centered the generals at the expense of broad civilian coalitions. So I think we need to completely upend the thinking that the international community has had thus far, and for the past 4 years, not even in the past year, and start from a position of how do we make the civilians central to any discussion on resolving this crisis? How do we engage as many civilians as possible and actually embrace the diversity rather than asking them all to read from the same hymn sheet? That is not what plurality is about. We want to embrace as much as possible the diverging views of the civilians rather than getting them all to sign on to a very narrow set of agenda items. With just my last point, we're talking about state collapse here, more than just the issue of a war in Khartoum and in Darfur. The Sudanese state has been centralized for so long that frankly, it cannot take Khartoum being the center of fighting for an extended period of time. Everything is reliant on Khartoum, and making Port Sudan the administrative capital for a few months probably won't bring about the same kind of results that are desired. So this requires, I think, the one very thin silver lining is that actually this is an opportunity to do things differently, and not seizing that opportunity to make political actors, civilian political actors, take center stage, to ensure that military actors are treated with, frankly, the legitimacy they deserve. I think that's something that will set Sudan up for effectively more and more of these conflicts as time goes by, rather than a reset of the Sudanese state and the way that it has done politics, it's the way that it has run the economy, and the way that it has engaged with civilian political constituents. Thank you. Can't hear you, Ruba.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you so much, Khulud. That was really insightful, and thank you for the many critical points that you've raised, especially on engaging civilians and resistance committees and the political discussions taking place now, and the political solutions that are being discussed. Thank you so much again. That was really powerful. We will now be moving to our next speaker, Tahir Al-Mu'tasim, who's Tahir is the spokesman of the Sudanese Journalists Syndicate. Tahir is going to be given his talk in Arabic, and I will give a very short translation after in English. طاهر حضرتك موجود معنا؟
نعم.
رح تلقي الكلمة بالعربي مزبوط؟
مزبوط.
تفضل.
تحياتي للجميع وشكرا للمنظمة العربية لحقوق الإنسان في بريطانيا على دعوة نقابة الصحفيين السودانيين للمشاركة في هذه الندوة الهامة التي تسلط الضوء على الأوضاع الحالية في السودان ومحاولة بذل الجهود اللازمة لوضع حد لهذا الصراع. أدى انفجار النزاع المسلح في السودان بين القوات المسلحة السودانية وقوات الدعم السريع في 15 من أبريل الماضي إلى تعميق معاناة أوضاع الصحفيين السودانيين. فبحسب مسح أجرته نقابة الصحفيين، كان قبل اندلاع هذه الحرب حوالي 250 صحفيا وصحفية قد تركوا المهنة، بينما هناك نحو 250 آخرين صاروا عاطلين عن العمل. هذا قبل اندلاع الحرب، ولكم أن تتخيلوا كيف ستكون معاناة الصحفيين في السودان بعد اندلاع هذه الحرب. منذ اندلاع القتال في منتصف أبريل الماضي توقفت الغالبية العظمى من وسائل الإعلام في السودان، مما شرد جزء كبير من الصحفيين والصحفيات، والأخطر أن الحقيقة قد غيبت عن المواطنين. كلنا نعلم أن أي حرب الضحية الأولى لها هي الحقيقة. فيما يعيش عدد من العاملين والعاملات في مجال الإعلام في ظروف صعبة، يواجهون مخاطر يومية بحثا عن الحقيقة وسط القتال. رصدت نقابة الصحفيين السودانيين عددا من الانتهاكات تجاه الصحفيين والصحفيات، مما مثل تهديدا لحياتهم وسلامتهم وتضييقا على حرية الإعلام. ورصدت أيضا صحفيين عالقين في أماكن عملهم لمدة أيام أبان انطلاق الحرب، وغصف لغرف الأخبار بوسط الخرطوم. ظل العشرات من هؤلاء الصحفيين محتجزين داخل هذه المكاتب دون ماء أو طعام لعدة أيام. نقابة الصحفيين قامت بدورها في مخاطبة الطرفين، في مخاطبة الصليب الأحمر، في مخاطبة الهلال الأحمر، لتوفير ممرات آمنة لهم للخروج. قبل اندلاع الحرب بفترة طويلة، بفترة ليست بالقصيرة، كان واضح للكثير من المتابعين أنها ستندلع لا محالة، وذلك بالنظر إلى التصريحات المتبادلة، وكذلك بالنظر إلى خطاب الكراهية الذي تصاعد بشكل حاد عبر وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي من أشخاص وهيئات تدعم كل واحدة أحد أطراف الصراع العسكري. منذ ذلك الوقت أدركت نقابة الصحفيين السودانيين بأن الحرب قادمة لا محالة، واستنادا إلى انتشار خطاب الكراهية بشكل واسع، خاصة من هذه القيادات المحسوبة على النظام السياسي السابق، وبالطبع من أنصار القوتين العسكريتين المتقاتلان. كان أول ما قامت به النقابة أنها بادرت بتوجيه الدعوة إلى عدد من الأجسام النقابية في السودان، وكان الاجتماع بغرض مناقشة تطورات الأحداث المتسارعة على الأرض بالتركيز على التصعيد من بعض القيادات. والأمر الثاني هو انتشار خطاب الكراهية والدعوة للحرب بشكل ملحوظ. وكان ينظر الاجتماع بيانا بتاريخ 14 من أبريل، أي قبل الحرب بيوم واحد، تمت فيه إدانة واضحة لكل ذلك، وتم فيه الدعوة إلى الاستماع إلى صوت العقل والالتزام بالحوار السلمي لحل الخلافات، وعدم الاستماع إلى الأصوات التي تهدف إلى إنهاء مشروع الثورة والتحول المدني الديمقراطي. صحيح أننا توقعنا اندلاع الحرب نظرا لما رصدناه من تطورات، ولكن لم نتوقعها بذات السرعة التي حدثت به وما آلت إليه الأحداث فيما بعد. بالتالي فإن الأولوية بالنسبة لنا صباح يوم 15 من أبريل يوم انطلاق الحرب هو تفقد الأوضاع بالنسبة للصحفيين السودانيين، خاصة الذين كانوا ما زالوا في أماكن عملهم وقت اندلاع الحرب. بحسب متابعة أوضاع الصحفيين السودانيين لقد رصدنا كثير من الزملاء الذين ظلوا عالقين في أماكن عملهم أو مكاتبهم لأيام طويلة، ومثل بعض الصحفيين الذين كانوا في المكتب الرئيسي لوكالة السودان للأنباء، وآخرين كانوا في مكتب التلفزيون والإذاعة، وبعضهم تعرض للتضييق من الجماعات المسلحة. بذلت النقابة جهود واضحة في الإفراج عن بعضهم عبر التواصل مع الجهات ذات الصلة من طرفي النزاع أو مع الوكالات الإنسانية التي استجابت بإجلاء العديد منهم من الأماكن التي ظلوا عالقين فيها. بالإضافة إلى ذلك فإن بعض المكاتب الإعلامية والصحفية تعرضت للتدمير والقصف العشوائي من طرفي النزاع المسلح، كما اقتحمت قوة يشتبه في تبعيتها لقوات الدعم السريع بعض المكاتب الصحفية في الخرطوم، وغني عن القول بأن أوضاع الحرب منذ اندلاعها في 15 من أبريل أفقدت العشرات من الصحفيين أوضاعهم، كما أجبرت وظائفهم، كما أجبرت كل الصحف الورقية على الإغلاق نهائيا. يضاف إلى أن الحرب أثرت بشكل واضح على خدمات الاتصالات الهاتفية والإنترنت، وهم وسيلتان كما هو معروف بالنسبة للصحفيين في البحث عن الأخبار والتحقق منها ونشرها للجمهور. وبالتالي فإن انقطاع الخدمتين وسواءهما في أوقات كثيرة أثر بشكل سالب في عمل الإعلاميين وفي إيصال رسالتهم. صحيح أن للحرب ضحايا كثيرون، ولكن أول ضحية بالنسبة للصحفيين هي المعلومات الصحفية الحقيقية، وبالتالي فإن مصادر الصحفيين في الغالب هي البيانات الرسمية التي تصدر من طرفي النزاع، وهذه في الغالب تحيط بها الشكوك من كل جانب وتجعل مهمة التحقق منها بالنسبة للصحفي صعبة. أيضا نجحت نقابة الصحفيين في تشكيل مرصد لمتابعة الانتهاكات التي تحدث من الطرفين المسلحين ومتابعة إفرازات الحرب الغاسية وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان أيضا من الإنجازات التي قامت بها النقابة مؤخرا بعد الحرب في الخرطوم فتح مكتب لها خارج السودان، تحديدا في عاصمة جمهورية مصر العربية القاهرة، والتي اضطر عدد من الصحفيين للمغادرة إليها بسبب الحرب. والغرض من هذا المكتب هو متابعة أوضاع هؤلاء الصحفيين السودانيين، خاصة أنهم لجأوا برفقة أسرهم، بأن غالب هؤلاء الصحفيين أجبرتهم ظروف الحرب على مغادرة منازلهم وبيوتهم بسبب أنها كانت ساحات للقتال، حيث تعرض بعضها للتدبير والإصابة بفعل القصف العشوائي. كما يؤسفنا أن نذكر أن إحدى الصحفيات السودانيات أصيبت بسكتة قلبية نتيجة للقصف الشديد الذي تصادف أنه كان قريبا من منزلها. أيضا من المسؤوليات التي قام بها المكتب الخارجي لنقابة الصحفيين السودانية والتواصل مع النقابات في الدول العربية والهيئات المهتمة بحقوق الإنسان ومنظمة العمل الدولية، ومن هذه المؤسسات نقابة الصحفيين المصريين التي بذلت مجهودا مقدرا لدعم ومساندة الصحفيين السودانيين. رفض العنف والحرب والدعوة إلى الحوار والحلول السلمية هو ما تؤمن به نقابة الصحفيين السودانيين، وهو ما ظلت تدعو إليه على الدوام عبر مواقفها المشهودة وعبر البيانات التي تصدر عنها بشكل دوري. ولذلك يأتي الموقف الداعم من نقابة الصحفيين لجلسات الحوار التي بدأت منذ أيام بمدينة جدة بالمملكة العربية السعودية برعاية منها ومن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. للمرة الثانية ونقدم شكرنا وتقديرنا للمنظمة العربية لحقوق الإنسان، وننتهز هذه الفرصة لمخاطبة الاتحاد الدولي للصحفيين من أجل تفعيل عضوية نقابة الصحفيين السودانيين باعتبارها الممثل الشرعي للصحفيين في السودان، وذلك من أجل الاستفادة من خبراته وخدماته. ونخاطب عبر هذه الندوة كل شرفاء العالم والمؤمنين بحقوق الإنسان وبحق التعبير من أجل بمساعدة السودان والوقوف من أجل الحقيقة في السودان والوقوف ضد الحرب وإنهائها. هي حرب الخاسر الوحيد فيها هو الإنسان والخاسر فيها الحقيقة. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا لك أستاذ طاهر على كلمتك، ونقدم تعزينا الحارة لأهل السودان وتضامننا الكامل في ظل الظروف الصعبة اللي عم بيعيشوها في هذه الأثناء. شكرا مجددا لحضورك وللكلمة اللي ألقيتها معنا اليوم. شكرا جزيلا. For everyone, you can see the English translation in the chat box because we won't have time to read the translation. We will move to our last speaker for this webinar, Hussam Hanafi, regional humanitarian analyst. Hussam, you're still with us, right?
Yes, I'm still with you. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. The floor is yours, Hussam.
Thank you very much. First, I'll apologize for not turning my camera back on. The power is out, and I don't think anybody wants to see my floating sweaty head.
That's fine.
Second, I want to say thank you to the Arab Organization for Human Rights in the UK for inviting me to speak. And I also want to say that it's an honor to be speaking in a panel filled with so many distinguished people whom I personally hold an immense amount of respect for. Having said that, I think for my talk, I'm going to try and situate us in terms of the humanitarian situation. And it's important to look at the last few years. Many people on this call have spoken about the political, social, and economic aspects, and those all play into the humanitarian situation. In 2018, before the revolution started, to put it mildly, Sudan was already in a difficult position. Since then, it's been affected by a number of crises, both global, national, and local. The COVID-19 pandemic, we had a 1 in 100 year flooding, intercommunal conflict began to spiral, particularly but not exclusively in the Darfurs. We saw conflict in the Kordofans, in Blue Nile, and other places as well. We had disease outbreaks in a number of different locations. And so the humanitarian situation in Sudan has been deteriorating for some time before the coup. Since the coup, in last year's lean season, we saw more than 11 million people in what is termed as crisis conditions or worse levels of food insecurity. That is to say that they have inadequate amounts of food consumption. And that is the lean season that we are now entering, actually. And so the timing of this conflict could not have been better, even if there is no good time for it. The 2023 Humanitarian Response Plan, which is the normative document for humanitarians in crisis-prone countries such as Sudan, estimated that there were going to be 15.8 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. This plan was prepared last year, again, before the conflict, and is going to be revised, and the numbers are going to be excessive. Some of our speakers have spoken about how critical Khartoum is to at the national level, a legacy of decades of centralization. The reality is that whatever humanitarians are now going to be anticipating in terms of increased needs, it's probably still going to be worse because we cannot fathom how damaging this war is going to be, not just in areas of conflict, but even in the parts of the country that are relatively safe. It's incredibly critical. Medical stockpiles, supply chains were based in Khartoum. The centralization of several ministries, such as the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Social Welfare, the centralization of financial flows, means that what little service delivery was available to the different states is going to be even more hampered now. irrespective of, as Khulud mentioned, the making Port Sudan the administrative capital, moving those things to Port Sudan, even if it is done, will take an incredible amount of time, and much of the damage will be done. We're seeing the same challenges around telecommunications and banking services that are critical. We are going into a planting season, excuse me. And the summer rains are going to be coming in, and many farmers who are dependent on funding as well as support from the central government are not going to be able to get it. That means productivity will go down immensely, again, all across the country, including in safe locations. The estimates for where Sudan was before the fighting are quite frankly bleak. It doesn't matter what sector you're talking about, whether that's food security and livelihoods, whether that's healthcare or nutrition. Sudan was already in a difficult situation. Before the fighting broke out, of the original humanitarian response plan, only 14% was funded. That means that a quarter of the way into the year, only 14% of the needs that were needs that were not just identified but targeted were filled. That is a huge gap. For this conflict to happen means that not only will this gap need to be filled, but the amount of funding that's going to be needed to fill that gap will grow significantly. And this is before we go into the challenges that humanitarian organizations, both local and national, local and international, are going to face during their time here. Access is incredibly difficult, not just because of insecurity, but because of the fractured nature of the state means that bureaucracies are not put in place that enable humanitarian action right now. There's also a significant risk, and another speaker had spoken about the politicization of aid, that aid is going to be weaponized is going to be weaponized by one side or the other. There's significant risks of aid diversion. That is to say that it is only in retrospective, or just only in hindsight, probably a year, 2 years from now, that we will truly understand the scale of the humanitarian crisis in Sudan. Like many others on this call, I'm not optimistic about the near-term prospects of this war ending. And so it is important that we focus now on how we are going to deliver for the people and children of Sudan. Lots of people have spoken rightfully around the resistance committees who are now on the ground delivering alongside other civil society and community-based organizations, and are doing so with, quite frankly, very little support. Another speaker also mentioned how the humanitarians on the ground who are delivering are in fact Sudanese, and I think that's a very important thing to speak about. It's very easy to look at the images and videos of UN convoys evacuating international staff to say that INGOs no longer have a presence. The reality is the vast majority of staff, local NGOs and international NGOs, as separate from community-based and civil society organizations, are in fact Sudanese. They are in these conflict zones. Many of them have moved to the safety of safer locations outside of Khartoum. Many of them are now delivering in incredibly volatile places and contexts in Darfur's and the Kordofans, and even a few of them in Khartoum. While operationally, there's a very strict kind of distinction between non-governmental organizations and the civil society that are now delivering. The reality on the ground is that the profile of someone who wants to help their country and their community is often the same. And so a lot of the membership of these organizations are volunteers or staff in the local and international organizations who are on the ground and delivering, even if their organization is incapable of doing so. And it's important that we create a space and an environment where they can be supported and where they can deliver in order to mitigate, as humanitarian action can never really solve everything, but at least mitigate the effects of this horrific war. That means that increasing amounts of pressure has to be put, and other speakers have spoken about how that pressure might be applied on the actors to respect international humanitarian law, I'm sure smarter people than me can figure out how to do that, as this is a rather tall order. But it's also important that the international community and the regional actors step up at this time, whether it is by providing funding, whether it is by finally pushing forward agendas that humanitarians have been speaking about for a long time. In this case, agendas such as localization that are going to be critical when it comes to delivery. The reality is that even the best funded INGOs will face difficulties implementing a number of these places. And they need to be able to support organizations that are operating in difficult conditions. And in order to do that, there needs to be a push from the donor community to reduce a little bit of the bureaucratic red tape, right? To talk about reduced compliance and risk measures that are rightfully there in place for most humanitarian implementation, but smaller youth-led organizations that have flourished during transition in Sudan and are now using the time using the experience they've gained those 4 years to deliver where many of us actually cannot. Finally, I did want to stress a little bit on the necessity of ensuring that everyone is speaking with the same voice. Some people have mentioned the the UN Security Council meeting, and there is in fact dissent between the different parties, and that's just not acceptable. There needs to be a bare minimum where we are advocating and working together in order to create monitoring and reporting mechanisms and support existing monitoring and reporting mechanisms for that matter, including those that include civil society and local actors on the ground, to ensure that we can, at the very least, in the future, hold the warring parties to account, to ensure that humanitarian aid, whoever is delivering it, reaches those who need it, and that perhaps for once the international community acts and the the INGOs act as a support system for the incredible work that is already being done by local staff across all designations of aid organizations, whether that's CSOs, CBOs, INGOs, LNGOs, or other actors that we haven't even mapped yet. Humanitarian work should not be the purview of any one group, nor should we pretend that there is these solid boundaries between them. The reality is that even when there are operational barriers, delivery on the ground is done through mutual aid in an ecosystem, and that the future response should look like that. Because again, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan we have yet to see the full scale of the crisis in Sudan, and I shudder to think of how bad it will be. Thank you very much, Ruba, for your time.
Thank you so much, Hussam, for telling us about the humanitarian situation on the ground now in Sudan. We extend our sympathy and full solidarity to the people of Sudan, and we hope this violence ends soon. Thank you again, Hussam, for being with us today. Unfortunately, we won't have time for questions and discussion now because we ran over time. But hopefully, we will organize another webinar where we can have all these necessary discussions. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I would like to thank our speakers again for their really important interventions and for their time. And we hope to see and hear you soon in another webinar. Thank you again, and good night.